where are the inspiring leaders of today if we've just gutted our education system and we've thrown out all the paradigms that have given inspirations to the founding fathers? I mean, these guys were Plutarch nuts. They were maniacs for biographies of the great leaders of the past. Like, it's no surprise that the quality of people that it produced, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Adams. And I think we could really stand to at least try an experiment of getting back to studying these figures from Plutarch, the Caesars, the Alexanders, the Pericleses, the Solons, the Lycurguses, as a way of like kind of raising our own ceiling and inspiring ourselves to face challenges that are maybe greater than we've ever faced as a country.
Welcome to Daring Greatly, Alex.
Great to be here, Johnny.
Great. Well, today we have the privilege of talking about Plutarch and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. And I want to begin with something that I actually stuck out to me from my interview with Andrew Roberts. We were talking about Winston Churchill, and he was talking about this sense of an apostolic succession among great political leaders and how Winston Churchill had the bust of Napoleon on his desk, who was inspired by Julius Caesar, who was inspired by Alexander the Great, who was inspired by Cyrus the Great, who we actually did a whole other episode on. And so I wanted to know what your thoughts were on kind of this idea that sort of these great men imitate great men, and how essential is that to political leadership and greatness generally?
Yeah. I think I love that image of like kind of like laying on hands of one great man to another. And the great thing about that chain is that you don't necessarily need to have the physical hands of somebody great laid upon you. Kind of like you could be some podunk provincial on the island of Corsica or St. Kitts and Nevis and read about them, and they can kind of reach through history or even across fiction, as Alexander was fascinated by the Iliad and the characters of the Iliad. But, it's really true that in so many fields, it's just taken as obvious that this is how you become great at what you do. Michael Jordan studies Magic Johnson, Larry Bird. Kobe studies Michael Jordan. The greats study the greats. I think Michael Jordan says something like that in his acceptance speech for, being inducted to the Hall of Fame. Steve Jobs studies Edwin Land, the great industrial. I mean, the pattern just across so many fields, the painters. And it seems like we don't take that for granted in the field of statesmanship anymore, which is so ironic because it's like the most pivotal occupation that you can have in like human society. But it's certainly the case that Caesar was obsessed with Alexander, and Alexander with both Cyrus and Achilles. And you see this in so many, just countless cases throughout antiquity.
Yeah, to the extent that, one, not many people study or even believe statesmanship is possible, right? It's sort of more of a bureaucratic kind of management kind of approach to, the political system. But to the extent that it is something that it's taught, it's really only taught through the lens of understanding kind of abstract political systems, right? And not really kind of the in-depth study of great individuals. So today, go ahead.
Yeah. And I think that, in a field as abstract as entrepreneurship or, finance, so often the principles do matter, but you learn them through studying concrete examples, right? So this just underlines the principle you're talking.
Yeah, you do case studies, and there's not much of that in politics. So getting to Plutarch, which is the subject of our conversation today. So who was Plutarch, and why should we read him today?
Plutarch is a classic author from the 2nd century AD, and it's funny that, my background is as a classicist, and I left academia a while back, but, it's striking how incredibly popular Plutarch was for throughout the centuries, especially since he was kind of rediscovered in the Renaissance by the Italian humanists, and then all throughout the early modern period. I mean, he's the second most likely book to be on your shelf in colonial America, like right after the Bible.
Really?
It's
Okay.
incredibly popular for that generation of founding Americas, and yet he's kind of taken a backstage role in the modern study of the classical world for a kind of, complicated set of reasons. But he's not the first author that you would read in a course at a university. He's kind of dropped off at, ironically, in comparison to somebody like Thucydides or Herodotus, who are not necessarily household names, but kind of better known than Plutarch. You're more likely to be forced to read that at a university. But Plutarch is a biographer, but he's a philosopher first and foremost.
Okay.
And he's known most for his work, The Parallel Lives, which is a biography collection of 48 biographies of 24 Greeks, 24 Romans, roughly. And he compared the lives of great men of Greece and Macedonia and of Rome. And he would pair them together. And basically his mission was to write concise biographies that kind of bite-size, 30, 50, 60 pages. And he used that genre of biography as a kind of training in greatness. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's been so appealing to statesmen and leaders. And Harry Truman talked about how it's his favorite book, and he's constantly
Truman did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Truman, he said he used, whenever he would run into a difficult situation in politics, he would always turn to Plutarch to try to figure out what was going on. He kind of used Plutarch as a library of human nature to try to pin people okay, now I get what's going on here.
Was Truman the last American president to do that? I imagine Eisenhower perhaps had some familiarity with Plutarch. Was there anyone after that you know of who would have I mean, it's kind of crazy. You would never hear an American president today say, what do I do? Well, let me pull out Plutarch.
Yeah, I think it goes to show, and I don't know of any other great examples since Truman. People believed that Lincoln must have read Plutarch as a boy, and then an interviewer was asking him, when you were reading Plutarch as a boy, and Lincoln said, oh, actually, I didn't read Plutarch as a boy. And then he went and read all of Plutarch to kind of rise into the role or something. But, I think that Truman gravitated toward Plutarch because, as so many of the other people who gravitated towards him, Truman was the last self-educated president. He was the last president not to go through college.
Okay.
And so he had to find for himself what were the most important books. And his dad bought him a copy, and his brother a copy of Plutarch when they were young boys, and used to read it to them at night. So, it's a lost tradition. I think it could stand to be revived.
Okay. Yeah, I certainly agree. In Plutarch, at the beginning of either the life of Caesar or Alexander, I can't exactly remember, talks about the difference between history and biography. What is biography? Why is that different than history?
Yeah. I'll start by, thinking about what Plutarch's big project is and how he uses biography. So he says in the beginning of another one of his biographies that he says, I began writing my biographies for the sake of others, but I find that I'm continuing the work for myself also, and using history as a mirror is what he says. And examining the qualities of these great men. He says, he talks about how he kind of welcomes them into his house, so to speak, and kind of observes them from up close, and can kind of see the details of who they were, and not just recount the stories of their great deeds. But so Plutarch's fascination is in character, and in virtue and vice. And he's not afraid to tell you about the vices, which are some of the most entertaining parts of the biographies. But at the beginning of the life of Alexander, he talks about, I'm not writing history. I'm not recounting all of the great battles and deeds of this great man. And he's working in this tradition where there's just tons of writings about Alexander the Great, who lived 4 centuries before him. What I'm focusing on is, a chance word or a joke, something said at a jest over a dinner conversation might reveal more of the character of the man than 100 battles. And he's kind of like, he compares himself to a painter, you know, where, you know, you just want to get the kind of wink of the eye just right. That just something shines out about the man. And I think that's how he describes his work. And history's proved him out. I mean, he's such a good storyteller, but he has such an eye for how to, you know, reveal the subtle movements of the soul, as he would call it. So that's what biography is for him. It's different from history. It's not aiming to give you a full explanation of the Persian Wars or the Civil Wars, but what the quality of men were who made things happen, and what we can learn from their successes, virtues, and also their mistakes.
So why do you think in our current moment in America, it's important to rediscover Plutarch?
Yeah, I started the Cost of Glory podcasts when I had this realization that young men, I would include myself in that as a young man, seem to lack for great paradigms that are sort of inspiring. And there are a lot of cultural reasons for that. I think the decline of our cultural knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans is very, very much the same problem as this crisis in masculinity that people are talking about, this crisis in leadership. Because, you know, in so many fields, politics especially, greatness is kind of crafted through emulation. This is certainly how the ancients thought about it, that you need to learn the techniques, you need to learn accounting, you need to learn the law, but most of all, you need to sit at the metaphorical feet or even the literal feet of the greats and let's just watch them and get that kind of inspiration, that energy that you get from being around people like that, whether it's in person, you just feel their energy, or, you know, just they could come off the page, like a really strong character, well portrayed in a biography can just like fill you with this kind of fire, this thumos. And people really seem to be talking about this, like, where are the inspiring leaders of today? And if we've just gutted our education system and we've thrown out all the paradigms that have given inspiration to the founding fathers. I mean, these guys were Plutarch nuts. They were maniacs for biographies of the great leaders of the past. Like, it's no surprise that the quality of people that it produced, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Adams. And so I think we could really stand to at least try an experiment of getting back to studying these figures from Plutarch, the Caesars, the Alexanders, the Pericleses, the Solons, the Lycurguses, as a way of like kind of raising our own ceiling and inspiring ourselves to face challenges that are maybe greater than we've ever faced as a country.
Yeah, and I love that it's not, the imitation is not, okay, you know, like I read Plutarch, I took my notes and like, you know, like check, I'll do this, then I'll do that. It's like you said, it's more like a fuel, you know, the energy that you just kind of imbibe. And then when these moments come, you just know how to act because that is what's, you know, inspiring and driving you forward. It's a very different way of kind of reading and imitating and learning.
Yeah. It's not like you take a bunch of notes and then you have to remember for the test.
You don't remember, you know, point number 7.
You didn't learn anything. No, you learn something just by, it's almost like a process of osmosis. And there's a deep mimetic apparatus, I would call it, that we have as humans, that this is how we learn things. It's we can't necessarily articulate how we learn to throw a ball, right? You just watch somebody do it and your body kind of picks it up. It's mirror neurons. And we have this deep, highly complicated neural structure that primes us to learn through watching and imitating. And I think we need to lean into that. Like we're built for that. Yeah. And like we're way more sophisticated than we give ourselves credit for, actually. Yeah. Absolutely. And the power of storytelling, really leaning into that as a training for leadership and for virtue. This is leaning into the best thing that we've got.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So Alexander and Caesar, these are two of perhaps the greatest Greek, the greatest Roman. You had mentioned in another interview that Lord Fairfax recommended, you know, I think these lives in particular to George Washington. and that earlier in his life, he was very drawn to Caesar and Alexander. Later in life, it was Cato really that captured his imagination. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So when you're fighting as a fledgling republic against a monarchy, maybe the paradigms that you look for are not the great monarchs of the past or the kind of proto-monarchs like Alexander and Caesar. But it's true that Washington started out just thirsty for glory, and Fairfax knew how to throw gasoline on that fire. Okay. And he recommended the campaigns of Alexander. Also, the Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars is another book that he recommended, just a classic of statesmanship and military leadership. And Washington actually, earlier in his career, he ordered a bust of Julius Caesar from Britain, and apparently they were out of stock. So he conveniently didn't have a bust of Caesar in his house when he was, fighting for the Republic. Okay. But Cato is kind of Caesar's great opponent.
Sure. And
it ended up like in the Revolutionary War period, Cato kind of became the figure of resistance against monarchy. Okay. And it was sort of not cool to emulate Caesar, even though Hamilton did it anyway.
Yeah. And even though Cato killed himself.
Yeah. And even though Cato was sort of like most famous for losing.
Sure.
Yeah. Which I think is so funny. But I think that Cato, and I'm actually working on a biography of Cato right now. He was sort of an untimely figure for the Roman Republic, but what he gave the founding generation, especially Washington, and Washington famously had this very popular play of Joseph Addison about Cato staged at Valley Forge. Okay. Like imagine his officers in their rags, just like
freezing cold,
declaiming the Republican virtues of Cato. And there's so many lines that Washington used to quote, and Patrick Henry, give me liberty, give me death. This is taken right out of Cato, Addison's Cato. But I think what Cato gave people is this resolution to put it all on the line and to be willing to even go as far as dying for the Republican cause. That this was the courage you needed to win in a fight that, from the outset seemed like quite a long shot, right? And I think Cato has given a lot of people that over the centuries.
Definitely. So Plutarch's Life of Alexander and Caesar, could you offer, I know these are long texts, but could you offer a brief summary of kind of the arc of both of their lives as Plutarch describes it?
Yeah, so why don't we start with Alexander? Plutarch begins his lives typically by, as much as he's able, he dwells on the childhood, and he sees the childhood as a very great field for exploring kind of illustrative moments of character. And so Alexander is the son of Philip II of Macedon, who's the king of Macedonia. Starts off as a really minor regional potentate and ends up conquering and subduing the fractious Greek city-states of mainland Greece, and he, Thebes and Sparta and Athens have been warring for centuries, and Philip manages to unite them all. And he has this grand ambition of then taking the war to Persia, uniting the Greeks and in this great expedition against Persia, which is something that I think he might have learned from the Spartan king Agesilaus. But a lot of Greeks were thinking like, this is how, if you're going to unite the Greeks, you need to give them a greater cause, which is payback for the Persian wars, which were, 150, 200 years earlier.
Okay.
And so this is kind of the environment Alexander is raised in. He's Philip's oldest son, and Philip keeps him with him on campaigns. He learns the art of war from early on. And he has a kind of proper Macedonian royal education, learning to throw a spear and horsemanship. But Philip also finds for Alexander the greatest tutor anybody could have ever in history, which is Aristotle, the philosopher. And Aristotle is not just famous in his day for the metaphysics and the biology, but he's also famously a political theorist of the highest caliber and a political practitioner. I think we should give him credit. He knew the art of persuasion. And so, Plutarch talks a lot about their relationship, about Alexander's fascination with Aristotle and with philosophy in general. And
real quick, just pause there. So there was an interesting scene that happened when Aristotle published some of his works, either the Politics or the Ethics. And this actually made Alexander mad because, he saw these as sort of, secret teachings for someone who wanted to really take over the world, right? And all of a sudden, wow, you're letting this advice get out to the common people or whoever could actually read it at the time. So why did Alexander get angry, and how did Aristotle respond?
Yeah, well, this is kind of gets into the weeds a little bit with Plutarch and his sources. So one of the things that people debate about with Plutarch's Life of Alexander in particular, he quotes a lot of letters of Alexander. And there are some scholars that think that a lot of these letters, that all of them are spurious, that they're kind of made up and kind of fan fiction. Other scholars think that they are, at least some of them are genuine. I think that's one that's still debated. But so the idea would be, the texts that we have from Aristotle today are mostly lecture notes. And there was certainly a dynamic in ancient philosophy where Plato talks about this in the 7th letter, where a philosopher will have his public teachings, which are kind of, whimsical and fun and entertaining and easy to understand for the masses, but then he'll keep the real meat of it secrets. And Alexander just criticizing Aristotle for apparently publishing some of his more secret teachings openly. But Aristotle responds by saying, no. People think that they got the real thing, but let me assure you, I've kept the most important things secret. And who knows what they were? Was it the nature of the soul? Was it the secrets of politics? Maybe a combination of the two. We'll never know. It's a great mystery.
Fascinating.
Yeah. But so he has this history of favoring philosophers, which you see throughout his career. And another thing that he maybe learned from Aristotle, maybe learned from just his education, was he had this love, Plutarch talks about over and over, he had his love for Homer. We talked about his inspiration from Achilles, the best of the Achaeans, the greatest Greek hero. And it was said that Alexander, throughout his campaigns, he had 2 books with him, the Education of Cyrus by Xenophon, but also a copy of the Iliad that was Aristotle's recension of. So Aristotle did a critical edition of the Iliad
with like notes in the margins or whatever.
Yeah, we have to presume. It's his. There's a lot of various versions of the Iliad floating around, and Aristotle and his students, I think we have to imagine, probably they collated the best version, like the most authentic. This is what we think Homer really wrote. And so Alexander kept a copy of that under his pillow every night, right next to his dagger on the campaign. So that
he even said at one point that someone asked him like what he received, some sort of a treasure chest or coffin or something, and basically it was very ornate. And they said, if you could put anything in here, what's your most prized object? And it's the Iliad.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. Aristotle's Iliad in particular.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So it goes to show the apostolic succession happening there, leadership. Just in quick kind of overview of Alexander's life. I mean, so Philip dies when Alexander's 20, and he gets murdered at a great festival. There's suspicions that Alexander was involved. I won't address those. I don't think he did it, but Alexander was kind of in this position where he inherited the keys to this incredible hot rod that Philip built, which was both the Macedonian army, which was an incredible war machine, and the diplomatic unity of Greece. And there's instantly challenges to his authority. States rise up in Greece, states rise up in Thrace, and Alexander has, a real, right on the edge time, securing his reign. But then very quickly he leads this expedition, and there's 3 great battles in which he, shocking the world, defeats the Persians. First, the Battle of Granicus, right as he crosses over into Asia, across the Hellespont near modern-day Constantinople. And then the Battle of Issus, where Darius, the king of Persia, is not there at the Battle of Granicus, but then he is there at the Battle of Issus, But Alexander defeats him. And then finally the Battle of Gaugamela, which is in central Iraq near Mosul, where he finally defeats Darius. And then maybe we'll get into more details as we have the conversation. Sure. But then, there's this whole expedition to India that he takes several years, and he finally returns after marching his troops through India and thumping around some kings and making his presence known, which was the kind of the extent of the Persian Empire. And Alexander really saw himself as not just the conqueror of Persia, but the inheritor of the legacy of Cyrus. Okay. He's becoming the king of kings, not just some Greek on the throne, but like, I am the legitimate heir of Cyrus. In a lot of ways, he believes that, and he illustrates that.
He venerates the tomb of Cyrus.
Yeah, he finds on his way back, he finds the tomb of Cyrus, and it says something like, "O mortal, here I lie, Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little bit of earth that I lie in. Don't disturb my tomb." And the interpreters tell him what it says, and so Alexander has the inscription translated and carved in Greek.
Okay.
Under the Persian.
Wow.
So I think that's a really important statement of venerating Cyrus and taking over his legacy. And then famously, Alexander gets some kind of a sickness.
Okay.
He gets back to Babylon and he dies. And instead of appointing a successor, he does have a son who's not born yet, baby son in the womb, who is legitimate. But instead of appointing a successor, his companions are all kind of filing around his bed and saying, "Alexander, who will run your empire? Who is going to be your successor? Who should it go to?" And, he says, so the legend goes, "To the strongest."
Okay.
And he dies. And then there's this great war over his legacy after that.
Yeah, which is so interesting. How so many of these great, people in real life that I've met, but also people that I've studied throughout history, the greatest often don't really have a clear succession plan,
right.
And it kind of at the end, things go to chaos. This happened with Cyrus. Even did have a succession plan, but his sons weren't quite up to his level, and it's just disaster afterwards. And what is it about kind of great individuals? Are they just so singular that we can't really expect the person who the baton is passed to really pick up their mantle? Or is there a good way to actually do the succession thing?
Yeah, it's a good problem. I mean, it's Marcus Aurelius, famously, Commodus was a terrible emperor, right? And Philip really lucked out with Alexander.
Sure.
Often it skips a generation, it seems.
Okay.
Somebody like Marcus Aurelius was always battling the barbarians on the border and entrusting the care of his sons to other people. And I think it's really what it takes to be a great ruler so often takes away from the family.
Sure.
Which is tragic, because it's not just your family that suffers, it's the whole kingdom that suffers if you have a kind of monarchic succession, and that's one of the reasons that the Roman Empire was so successful, is because there was not that fixed rule of primogeniture, or that my son should rule after me. Augustus was famously adopted by Julius Caesar, and then he adopted an heir of his own. And then Marcus Aurelius was in this tradition of the Germans call it the adoptive Kaiserzeit. Hadrian adopts Antoninus. I think Hadrian adopts Antoninus. Do I have it the other way? Anyway, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus Aurelius, they're all adopted by their predecessors for their virtue. So that's one way people have solved
and even in Byzantium, Justin adopted Justinian, right? And that's how it went.
Yeah.
Let's dive a little bit more into the details. Some maybe not the details, maybe the kind of the notable stories or moments from Alexander's life. So the origin story, right? There's a myth about how he was conceived and came into the world. I'm wondering if you could, tell that story, and also, does it take a great myth to make a great man? Are these two things kind of essential? Yeah.
So the story is that, and there's a few versions of this. in the one that I'm most familiar with, Alexander's mother is this Epirot queen. She's not a Macedonian, but a Greek of some sort. And she has this dream on the night that Alexander's conceived that like Zeus visits her as a lightning bolt.
Okay.
And it's not clear if she told this story when Alexander was a young man, or whether there was a kind of reading back of this later. But the most famous moment in Alexander's origin story is he conquers Darius at the Battle of Issus, the second battle. So he hasn't totally won the Persian Empire for himself, but he's basically conquered the western half of it, Turkey, and then he has a heck of a time subduing the city of Tyre, which is an island. It's very difficult. He has to build a land bridge. But he gets down and he gets to Egypt. Egypt welcomes him in. They're like, we don't really see any sense in resisting Alexander. And so once he gets to Egypt, he is declared the pharaoh. And pharaohs are divine.
Yeah.
And he makes an expedition to this very, very remote oasis, the Siwa oasis, which is deep in the Sahara Desert near the border of Libya today. And there's a famous oracle of Ammon there. And basically, long story short, the oracle there declares him to be, sort of welcomes him as a son.
Okay.
And the Greeks saw Ammon as a manifestation of Zeus.
Okay.
So that kind of confirmed to him this divine parentage. And so I think the origin story is maybe, and this kind of gets tossed around a little bit as a political football, like, Alexander's only a half human. He's like Achilles. He's a son of a divinity. And it's not clear that he really believed this, but it's certainly a myth that was convenient for him to reach out. He played it up.
He needed to.
Yeah. And, funny enough, I think a lot of people really respected that. Like, somebody like the Persian king or the Persians, they want, okay, their king of kings is getting conquered. Well, would you rather him be conquered by a mortal or by a god? Yeah. It sort of honors them in a way that he's this sort of superhuman figure. The story of Alexander and religion is a fascinating one. There's whole books written on this.
Yeah, I can imagine. So another thing that really stood out to me is kind of throughout his life, he encounters greatness in other people on occasion, even in some cases his enemies. And it kind of is very, it's an arresting moment for him. And you can tell that he has a lot of respect for people that also care about greatness or who do daring things. And a couple, stories come to my mind. There was one where there was a woman, and you probably know the details more than I would, but evidently the town was being conquered by Alexander's armies, and several of the soldiers had, entered her house. They were, they raped her. They were kind of wanting to steal from her. And she said, I actually threw a bunch of treasure out back in the well, let's go have a look. And as the man was looking over the well, she pushed him in and then started to grab rocks and just kept throwing them down the well and killed the guy, and I think his commanders probably wanted to kill her and make an example of her. And he basically said, whoa, this woman is daring. Like, she has real guts, like, I'm going to kind of pardon you. I don't mess around with that. And then another one was.
That story, he actually found out that she was the sister of one of the great commanders of Thebes, which is a city, and that he had, defeated in battle. And so for all the more reason, he felt like, let this woman go. She's great.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And then there's the account of his encounter with Diogenes, the philosopher. He was expecting that, I don't know, maybe that, there were favors or things that he could do for Diogenes, and Diogenes would be grateful. And, I guess a bunch of people were watching kind of him walk up to him for the first time. And, he approaches him and asks, if there's anything, Diogenes, that I can do for you. And he basically just doesn't even look at him and just says, can you get out of my way and, stop blocking the sun?
Right.
And then, maybe some people laugh, and Alexander responds, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes.
Yes.
So there's this,
And Diogenes is said to have responded, if I were not Diogenes, I would be Diogenes.
Okay. I love that.
Yeah.
So what is this? He when he sees greatness in other people, boldness, there's just innate kind of respect. He lets them.
And you see this. I think it's of a piece with his kind of hero worship, literally and figuratively. You know, when he gets over into crosses over into Asia, there's a great temple to Achilles there at Ilion, which is the ancient Troy, more or less. And he goes up and he venerates Achilles at the temple, and somebody asks him, we also, Alexander, while you're here, we have the pan flute that Paris played, who stole Helen away and started the Trojan War. Would you like to see that? And Alexander says, no. But if you have the lyre that Achilles played in Book 9 of the Iliad, when he sung the glories of the men of the past, this famous scene, I'll take a look at that.
Okay.
I don't think they had it.
Yeah.
But and after the Battle of Gaugamela, he sent all of these gifts out to like famous athletes in Sicily. He declared that he would rebuild Plataea, which is this great, not great. It was a minor city in Boeotia that, resisted the Persians and was destroyed afterwards. And so he has this sense that like, it's the duty of a king to honor greatness, to honor virtue, and to kind of like set up these other paradigms of what he admires and what he thinks his people should admire. And I think, he had, I think it was genuine, but I think it was also savvy because, like a great king knows that he has to uphold models of greatness for other people if he wants to have the right people as subordinates in leadership, and he wants to kind of like care for the moral well-being and happiness of his citizens. So I think Alexander was actually quite savvy in that way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Another thing that really stands out, especially after studying Xenophon's The Education of Cyrus, is both Alexander and Cyrus really prize kind of moral restraint. And they, deny themselves, whether it's food, whether it's, whether it's kind of women and sex, right? They're very disciplined about, Cyrus says that restraint is a feast, right? These were things that he instilled in his men because they were striving for glory. He was striving for empire, and he had to suppress his kind of baser desires. So you see this also throughout the life of Alexander. Now it's interesting because in as relates to women, he was quite chaste. He had an opportunity to take Darius's wife, and he was allegedly very beautiful after he conquered the Persians, and he did not, and this actually brought Darius, it sort of broke Darius when he was just assuming that Alexander was taking advantage of her. And then when she actually died and there's this beautiful state, funeral, he said, oh my gosh, he's only doing this because he must have had this, whirlwind romance with her. And then someone reassured him, no, he was like perfectly honorable towards her. And then to him, that was even more like, wow, you think that the, resisting, being with my wife is harder than conquering the Persians in battle, right? Like, so it's remarkable. But then on the other side, they talk about how he is restrained. But then he does kind of give in to drunkenness quite a bit and make decisions in those moments that aren't particularly prudent. So I don't know, what role do you see this restraint in pursuit of empire playing in Alexander? Yeah,
well, it seems to have been especially important for his image of like being a just king of Persia to keep his hands off of the nobles' wives, and when he met his barbarian queen, later queen Roxana, he saw her dancing apparently and was just captivated. But he could have had her just that night. So Plutarch says, but he didn't want to do it without the like legal sanction of marriage, and so he married her and tried to have legitimate children with her. But so I think that's really important to be, for his image as like a just ruler, right? And the drunken, Plutarch, I think Alexander was really Plutarch's boyhood hero.
Okay.
But he's a fair historian. He tends to try to make Alexander seem to bring out the strong parts of his character. And he says, well, people talk about Alexander as a drunkard, but for the most part, he would just kind of have a big bowl of wine and sip it very slowly and just spend a lot of time with the wine in his hand and not drink too much.
He starts off with that, but then it seems to devolve a little bit.
Yeah, as he keeps getting, spears in his ribs and, he gets hit on the back of the head and he loses his sight for a few weeks. I mean, he starts taking a beating on the Indian campaign. And so I think it's at Samarkand, which is I think it's in Uzbekistan, right? So there's this feast. The famous story is, this friend of his, Cleitus, who at the Battle of Granicus, one of the Persian nobles is raising his sword to lop off Alexander's head. And Cleitus comes right at the last moment and chops off the guy's arm and saves Alexander's life. This guy, loyal, noble Macedonian, they're having a party at Samarkand. And, one of the court poet sort of flatterer types starts unleashing some verses upon how, fat and stupid the Macedonians are, just for fun, a roast. And Alexander laughs and lets it go on. I think that there's a lesson there that a leader should be very careful about letting his subordinates get insulted in his presence, right? And so Cleitus takes offense. He's like, Alexander, I see that you've gotten some, you think that we're a funny lot, we Macedonians. You're recruiting all these Persians into your entourage and training them up. The people that we've conquered, you're promoting. He challenges Alexander with this, because this was a big issue that Alexander faced. Is he wanted to kind of have this melding of the two peoples and to be the king of kings, but also the king of Macedonia. Big cultural issues to resolve there, but and so it caused a lot of tension. And Cleitus challenges him on this. And it just kind of escalates, and they're both drunk.
Cleitus is the one who saved his life.
Yeah, Cleitus is the one who saved his life before, and who feels, as his friend who saved his life, who grew up with him for all we know, that he has a kind of what the Greeks would call parousia, the right to say anything in front of the king. And the king really needs those kind of people around, right? And this is why the incident's all the more tragic. And so there's an escalation. Alexander demands a spear. His bodyguards won't give it. His friends of the Cleitus drag him out of the banquet. Alexander's being held back. And then Cleitus busts back in. He gets free of the guys who were holding him back. And he comes back and he just keeps insulting Alexander. And so Alexander finally gets a spear. And he runs him through. He kills one of his best friends who saved his life in this fit of drunkenness. And it said that he immediately just felt horrible and ruined, ruined his week. And he felt really guilty about it. And I think that really goes to show how dangerous alcohol could be for a leader like that. And it's brought many men to ruin. Alexander managed to recover from it, but it was something that he carried with him to his grave.
Shame that he carried his whole life.
Yeah.
And then his end, Alexander's demise, as it seems like he's becoming more and more superstitious towards the end of his life. Also, the drinking, seems to some extent to kind of become more frequent. Now, do you think I don't know, was this did he, like some people say, maybe did he have some sort of illness? And so it wasn't really the drinking or the superstition that was a byproduct of this illness? Or to what extent is he responsible for his own untimely demise versus this is just what the fortune kind of had in store for him?
Well, Plutarch says, I think it's really insightful. He says that Alexander loved his honor and his fame and his glory more than pleasure, but even than his empire himself. Than his empire itself. He loved the glory of the conquest. He loved the kind of the greatness of it all more than he loved the idea of ruling this empire. And for that reason, I think that's at least Plutarch's take on why maybe he didn't take as good of a care of himself as he could have. And there are a lot of stories about how exactly Alexander died. There's even this crazy conspiracy theory that Aristotle encouraged Antipater, this other Macedonian noble, to poison Alexander, which I think is just total hogwash. But it kind of goes to the sense of like extreme suspicion, like especially after Alexander's death, everybody's, suddenly all of his warlord, commanders are at war with each other very quickly within a matter of weeks. And so, was he poisoned? Was he sick? Did he drink himself to death? It's not really clear, but it is clear that he didn't take good care of himself. And Plutarch recounts a lot of portents as he's going back into Babylon, and he's, the philosophers telling him, don't go to Babylon, but it's fate somehow. Sure. But it's not exactly the healthiest climate. There by the river in the extreme heat. So
does the empire fall apart after he dies, or what kind of happens in the aftermath?
Yeah, well, for the full story, I would send people to my biography of Eumenes of Cardia on the Cost of Glory, which is a Plutarch character that is kind of like, so he's Alexander's royal secretary, but he rises up in the ranks, and they put him on a horse at some point, and they realize that this guy is incredible in battle. And so Eumenes is the guy right after Alexander dies trying to hold the empire together. There's all these, Ptolemy and doesn't really believe in the idea of a united whole. Just gets Egypt for himself, and starts this dynasty. Antigonus is another big player trying to take over the whole. I mean, there was some kind of a regency that Perdiccas was in charge of. They were kind of holding the throne for Alexander's infant son that was born right after he died, or Alexander's brother Aridaeus, who was maybe mentally disabled, but either way, just not fit for rule. And they kind of represented legitimacy. Eumenes is trying to defend these guys for the kind of like the continuing the legacy of Alexander, the Macedonian royal line. But it doesn't work out, long story short. And they end up, the wars of succession last 40 years with a few bouts of peace. And kind of bring truth to the statement. If he didn't say, to the strongest, that was de facto what happened. Sure. Which is a tragedy. And, the political unity of his empire didn't hold together. But I think it was still a noteworthy accomplishment, because the cultural unity of within any of these Greco-Macedonian kingdoms had a profound impact on the history of the Middle East. And, it's the reason that they're speaking Greek in Egypt and the Levant and in Turkey all throughout the Roman period. It's the reason that the gospel can spread very easily in Greek through those regions. So the impact was great, even though, the idea of this whole empire didn't hold together in the end of the day.
Okay. One last question before we move to Julius Caesar. So what is the relationship between, this is a big question, but between a philosopher and a statesman, or a philosopher in political power? So you see Aristotle, tutoring Alexander. But then as we get to kind of Caesar, you see kind of the antipathy between a Cicero and a Caesar. So what is this? I don't know. I guess, how do you see it as, classicist, a philosopher yourself? What is the ideal relationship between political power and philosophy?
Yeah. Well, the best philosophers in antiquity tended to gravitate toward rulers. Plato with Dionysius II at Syracuse, Aristotle with Alexander, Diogenes sort of the exception that proves the rule. But Alexander had, he didn't bring Aristotle on campaign, but he did bring a disciple of Aristotle, Callisthenes, who's actually a biographer, a historian, and wrote a notable history on the campaigns of Alexander, up to the point where Alexander had him executed because they had a falling out. But it's a tense relationship, and it's hard for both parties, because what a philosopher, the role a philosopher serves ideally is to speak truth to power,
Sure.
the classic cliche. But it's really true. And the word there is parousia, the ability to say anything in Greek. And like that is something that a ruler needs, but it's also is something he finds annoying, typically.
Yeah. And who had the right in this cultural context to practice the honest speech to the political? Was it only a few people that had a certain blessing, or was it any philosopher? Or what?
Yeah, I think it's something that you just have to that every philosopher needs to negotiate for himself in real time and just try it and see if it works. and see if they keep you around or if they, and so Aristotle said Callisthenes was a great speaker, but he lacked sense, that he didn't know when to stop. He was this ascetic figure, constantly kind of like aloof and disapproving and tut-tutting people. And a lot of Alexander's companions, his sort of nobles, didn't really like Callisthenes. And so they liked this other guy who was another kind of rival philosopher. So you often find like several of them kind of backbiting against each other. But I think that that's one of the things that really distinguishes an ancient philosopher from a modern philosopher is they don't owe their position to anyone but themselves. There's no institution really for consecrating somebody a philosopher. There's no formal role, but somebody like Alexander likes to have smart people around. He's a very curious man, actually. And I think that's genuine. Like and I don't think you see this in the same way with Caesar, but part of what inspires Alexander is this kind of like wanderlust. He wants to go and see the ocean, visit the Caspian Sea, and meet these strange people. And he interviews these gymnosophists, they're called. Naked sophists in India. And he interviews them. They're basically, I don't know, Indian holy men, right? That the Greeks are like, these are philosophers. Yeah. So, a leader likes to have those kind of people around, but and so it's kind of up to you as an intellectual to kind of prove your worth and keep them entertained, but also keep them challenged enough so that they feel like they're getting some value out of you.
Sure.
Some kind of like counterintuitive, uncorrelated advice, because they're surrounded by flatterers all the time.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to Caesar. Why did Plutarch pair Caesar with Alexander?
Right. Yeah. So I think he just saw that unquestionably Alexander was the greatest of the Greeks. And by the time Plutarch was writing, probably 100 years after Caesar's dead, unquestionably Caesar's the greatest of the Romans. They both kind of die young and tragically and leave their work unfinished. And I think he paired them because Caesar wanted to pair himself with Alexander, and I think that anybody that becomes worthy of the title the Great, like Alexander, or deserves to be compared to Caesar, will find their way to the biographies of these guys, emulate them too, like a Napoleon. So I think that probably explains why they were paired together, but they're operating in very different worlds. I mean, Caesar is born into a noble Roman family that's kind of fallen on hard luck. It's not so he's from this great family, the Julii, but his father dies kind of young, and they're not that wealthy. But he's got talent, and he. From an early age, he's making connections. He marries the daughter of this very prominent politician, Cinna, when he's like 16 or 17, which is really young to get married for a Roman. But he from the very beginning, I think you can see Caesar already picking his side in Roman politics. There's basically two factions in the Roman Republic. There's the Optimates and the Populares, and scholars will say, it's an oversimplification. And it is, but that does kind of hold true. And so when Caesar's a teenager, the dictator Sulla is in power in Rome. He's just won a civil war. He's an Optimate. He's from the noble side of Roman politics, from the right wing, let's say. But Caesar has his aunt was married to Gaius Marius, who's this great populist general, this great kind of nobody from Arpinum, which is where Cicero's from, kind of just rose on his talent. And so Caesar already kind of like picks his side early on in Roman politics, marrying the daughter of Cinna, who's this great populist, a friend of Gaius Marius. My favorite story from Caesar's youth, maybe everybody's favorite story, is he gets captured by pirates as a young man, and he, you know, kind of wins them over and entertains them. He used to recite poetry to them, compose poems and speeches, and when they wouldn't appreciate them, he would berate them as tasteless barbarians, and they would just laugh. And he says, "Someday I'm going to execute all of you." Oh, Caesar! And then he does. Okay. So they try to ransom him, and he asks them what they're asking, and you know, they say, well, you know, this many talents, and Caesar's like, "What? Are you kidding? You need to double that." And it's funny, but it's also, you know, he gets from an early age that could be something that that effectively says his value in the political sphere. Like if he's a really noble young youth, he should be ransomed for a lot. It's like important for his reputation.
And did he have a sense at that age of his sort of arching mission to be the number one man in Rome? Like, was that, at what point in his life did that really crystallize?
The first evidence we have of that, although I think it probably was very, very early on. If you look at his actions, like, this is a spirited kid. I mean, he stands up to the dictator Sulla. Sulla asks him to divorce his wife because Cinna is sort of like, you know, damnatio memoriae. Cinna's dead and Sulla's won, and you know, Sulla's like, you gotta distance yourself from this populist. And Caesar says, "I will not divorce my wife. You know, go do whatever with yourself." And Sulla famously said, you know, he spares him. His friends are like, "You should execute this kid, this chump standing up to you, this little teeny bopper." And Sulla says, no. I think Sulla wanted to execute him. That's right. Yeah. His friends are like, "Don't do this." And so Sulla says, "Well, you're fools. I'll spare him, but you're fools if you don't see many a Marius in this kid." So there's stories of his greatness from that young age, but it's really when he's like around 33, going out as I think a quaestor into Spain, that we get this famous story where on his way out in the Alps, he is in some podunk Gallic town, and his friends are saying, "Caesar, I bet these natives have their own competitions for first man and whatever, excuse for the town this is. And, you know, they have elections and they strive just as hard as we do. Isn't it silly to imagine that?" And Caesar says, you know, straight face, like, "I would rather be the first man in this town than the second man in Rome." Like, that's not silly at all. And so he gets out to Spain, and there's this famous story of him he visits this temple of Hercules, I think it is, in Spain, and there's a statue of Alexander there. And he's 33. Alexander, he knows, died at around 33. And he's found weeping by his friends. And he says, his friends say, "Caesar, why are you crying? What's up?" And he says, do you not think it a matter for sadness that while Alexander had conquered so many nations when he was 33, I have done nothing worthy of such accomplishment? So he's already comparing himself to Alexander.
At what age is he here?
Around 33.
30, yeah.
But, you know, Alexander had advantages that he didn't, you know, like a father who was a king and a conqueror already. And Caesar really has to, in building his career, he has to really leverage other people's talents, other people's money. He builds his career on taking just enormous amounts of debt and betting that with, you know, largesses to the populace, staging games, that he'll build enough of a political reputation that he can get elected. And if you get elected, then you can find ways to make that money back,
Sure.
whether clean or dirty. And so, but by the time that he's 33, he's probably just up to his ears in debt, but already kind of making a name for himself in Roman politics. But it takes him a lot longer, for sure.
And so his primary method of acquiring political power is the combination of kind of essentially kind of bread and circuses for the people that's debt financed, and then the sort of military power, which enables him both to, hey, if you're the guy with the big army, right, then that is something in your favor, but also to then use that military power to acquire the money to then pay back some of the debt. So it's just kind of the two.
That's a standard pattern for Roman politicians. You get office in Rome, you hold a consulship or a praetorship, and then you're given a governorship. And if you're a governor of a province, you get an army and you can beat up the natives. You can find some excuse that they're rebelling and plunder them. And Caesar does do that after he's praetor. But, so he gets to about 38, 39, and he doesn't really have a great military record. I mean, he does knock around a few tribes when he's in Spain as a praetor. But I think one of the signature talents of Caesar was finding these leverage points in politics. So on the one hand, as a young man, he's taken on the mantle of the populists who had lost the Civil War. Gaius Marius was the figurehead there. Cinna was another figurehead there. We talked about how he's already very much in that family. But when his aunt dies, he stages this lavish funeral for her, and he brings out images of Gaius Marius to remind you that he's, in this family. And then when similar thing when his wife dies. So he's already kind of like making a name for himself as a successor to Gaius Marius. These people who don't have a voice, he sees they don't have a voice, and he's kind of leveraging that populist energy, which I think is really perceptive. And it's strategic empathy,
strategic empathy.
Yeah, empathy not as a virtue, but as a tool.
Sure.
Yeah. And so that's one way that he's really good at using leverage in politics. Another way is, so when he comes back from his tour of duty as a praetor, this famous moment where he wants to, I'll talk about the other incident in a second, but basically the way that he becomes a consul after that, he's convinced that he wants to become a consul as soon as he can. He finds two men who have a need, Pompey and Crassus, the two current greatest men of Rome. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a financier. Pompey, the greatest conqueror of Rome. And they're kind of frenemies, they're constantly competing with each other. They have, cordial relations in public, but they have very different interests that clash with each other. And so, Crassus has a lot of kind of backbencher Senate figures in his political network. Pompey has a ton of wealth from conquering the East and popular acclaim, but he doesn't have a lot of political power in the Senate. And they both want things. And Caesar sees, all right, we can make a deal here. And he brings them together. He kind of reconciles them. And it's called the triumvirate. It's called the first triumvirate. They make this pact. Okay, Pompey and Crassus will help me get elected consul. I'll pass Pompey's laws. I'll pass Crassus's laws. I'll help you guys out. We think of it as a triumvirate in retrospect, but at the time it was not a triumvirate. It was a duumvirate. It was Caesar, this very junior guy, promising, but not powerful, putting these two powerful people together. Which I think is really key to his genius.
I think we see, I guess, throughout his life. So retrospectively, we call it, like you said, it's called the triumvirate, right? But it's not really a formal legal institution, right? This is this is another part of how Caesar changes or maybe keeps the forms in place, but actually changes the fundamental constitution, the unwritten constitution of the regime. To what extent was that tactic? He was very deliberate about using that tactic, right? To kind of keep the forms in place, but to change the nature of the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Augustus learned the same lesson when he was founding the Roman Empire, a monarchy. He very wisely followed Caesar's basic tactic there and kind of cobbled it out of existing institutions.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't create an office of emperor. He just
Sure.
united the power of the tribune of the plebs and the priesthood, the Pontifex Maximus, and gets elected consul in succession and succession and succession. So, and that really, if you're going to do a political transition, like, that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's this kind of wild card in Roman politics that they have this office, the tribune of the plebs, which is, there's 10 of them elected every year, and they have the ability, if they have a popular mandate, you know, they can call an assembly and get any law passed by a popular vote of the kind of general plebs. They're supposed to get permission from the Senate. They don't have to.
Okay.
And Caesar uses this office during his consulship to get himself granted, with the support of, you know, Pompey's got a lot of guys in the plebs, so does Crassus, that, like, these two guys have political networks that can kind of get that vote through.
Sure.
He gets himself past this law to grant him this extraordinary command. It's not the first extraordinary command in Roman politics, but basically a 5-year long, which is very long for a Roman commander, 5-year long command of Cisalpine, Transalpine Gaul. It's Cisalpine Gaul, and then Illyria at first, which is kind of like Slovenia, Croatia, and then it gets extended to Transalpine Gaul. And he knows, because the Romans only control a little sliver of France, he knows there's a huge military opportunity there. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of against precedent, you know, but it's legal.
Yeah.
And that's really important. It's really important for him to always do it legally if you can. and you know, he generally does. But there's all kinds of ways to kind of push the system to its limits in Roman politics.
Okay.
Break precedent, but stay within the letter of the law. So yeah, he knew how to manipulate the system.
And Cicero, someone who is revered throughout the West, you know, the church fathers loved Cicero. Thomas More said he never left the house without Cicero's on duties at his breast pocket. The founders also loved Cicero. So why does Cicero dislike Caesar? What's kind of at the heart of their disagreement?
Yeah, they had this really fascinating, complex relationship that was up and down, friendly and hostile. The first falling out they had was Cicero was convinced that Caesar was, with Crassus, behind the Catilinarian conspiracy, which is with this great conspiracy that's it was kind of a populist conspiracy to overthrow the state that Cicero faced and fought and subdued successfully in his year as consul in 63 BC. And he knew, and he didn't. He apparently published, I think, papers like posthumously after Crassus had died, after I think even Caesar had died, that he had evidence, hard evidence to prove that Crassus and Caesar were in on it. But they never...
And which is then, in Cicero's view, why Caesar wanted them to be more lenient and have a trial then for the conspirators.
Right, yeah. Cicero wanted to execute them, but he also... as consul, you know, to do that, you get to get the Senate to kind of authorize you as consul to basically break the law, which is you can't execute a Roman citizen at all, I think, but certainly not without trial. I think you can execute them if they've committed treason. But in this senatorial debate that Sallust recounts in the War with Catiline history that he wrote, it's Caesar swaying the Senate against execution, and then Cato is the one who sways them back toward execution. It's the first clash between Caesar and Cato as both young politicians. But so that was kind of like that I think that whole fiasco attuned Cicero's antenna to the problem of Caesar, who's got bigger designs on the Republic. And so he opposes them. They actually invite him into the first triumvirate. They say, hey, you can be our spokesman.
Really?
Yeah, Caesar tries to make a deal with him, and he turns him down. And so that was very annoying to Caesar, and Caesar had a way of paying him back for that. And then they reconcile later. They exchange letters when Caesar is out fighting the Gauls. In 55, they talk about how they both enjoyed Lucretius's new poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. So, and they, it's a very long and stormy relationship. And Cicero was the man that both Pompey and Caesar, when they later had a falling out, both tried to court and get on their side. And Cicero had reasons to be loyal to Pompey, but he wanted to stay neutral. In the end, for the longest time, he stayed neutral because he didn't want to offend Caesar, his friend, his good friend Caesar. That's politics in a republic for you. Yeah. You can't burn bridges like you can in so many other systems.
So then Caesar, he takes so they're wanting to, the Senate is wanting to recall Caesar back from Gaul to Rome. I guess they're worried about him amassing power, and Caesar crosses the Rubicon. Essentially, he brings his troops into Italy, where he's technically not allowed to bring them. Right. So then this precipitates the civil war between him and Pompey.
Yeah, and so this is fast forwarding from Caesar goes out to Gaul in 58 BC, and he doesn't even enter Italy or Rome for like 9 years. It's kind of amazing, because if he does, it implies him laying down his imperium, his consular authority. But yeah, 49 BC in around January 6th, he crosses the Rubicon. The Senate has given him an ultimatum. There was a whole year and a half of negotiations building up to this. They're trying to get him, basically his command is coming to an end, and his enemies are just foaming at the mouth, saying, "We're going to prosecute you for all of your crimes, crossing the border of your province without authorization, breaking treaties," etc. They have this laundry list of things that, as a proconsul, he has immunity from prosecution. As a governor, that is. As a consul, he would have immunity from prosecution. He wants to run for consul in absentia, but you're not allowed to do that. And so he's asking for an exception. Pompey grants him an exception, but then he walks it back. So there was a kind of a betrayal of trust there. That the two men had been friends, Pompey and Caesar. Pompey had married Caesar's daughter. She died in childbirth in 54, very tragically. And so all the time, Pompey sort of doesn't think that Caesar's going to do it. They keep giving him ultimatums. Caesar's the junior partner in the relationship between the two of them. He doesn't think Caesar's going to cross the Rubicon. His friend Caesar, he's just totally taken off guard by it, which is one of the reasons I think he loses the Civil War, because Caesar was, as Cicero said, we are facing a man who fears nothing and is ready for anything. I love that. And indeed he was. Yeah.
So to fast forward a little bit, so he eventually ends up winning the Civil War, defeating Pompey. Scipio has kind of Cato cornered. Cato commits suicide. Caesar goes back to Rome. What happens then?
Yeah, so Caesar goes back to Rome, and he's declared... Is he declared a dictator for life then? Or I think he has to finish his a second campaign in Spain to eliminate the sons of Pompey. He gets one of them, the other escapes. So I think Caesar makes one of his great, rare political miscalculations. After he defeats Cato, even more than Cicero maybe, Cato was the figurehead, the symbol of the glory of the old republic and the virtues that had built Rome. Cato famously is a Stoic. This is, and this is one of the reasons why the American founders are so interested in him as this kind of symbol of the old republic. And so Cicero publishes a kind of, eulogy of Cato, a book praising his virtues. He knows Caesar's not going to be too happy, but they're friends, and he thinks Caesar will kind of let it go. And so Caesar is annoyed enough by this praise of Cato that he writes an anti-Cato. He writes a whole kind of dirty poem just ridiculing Cato as a drunkard, which Cato actually did. Of his few vices, drinking was one of them. As a miser, as a trafficker in women. I mean, there's all these things that Caesar had, a whole career of insults to throw at Cato. And he kind of like, in a way, like stomped on Cato's grave.
Mhm.
And this becomes, I really think it's true that it kind of consolidates the resentment against Caesar, this kind of secret resentment that people had, that for all of that Caesar was so good at pardoning his enemies and showing clemency and being a conciliator after the Civil War. Cato deprived him of that right. That's precisely why Cato committed suicide, to not give Caesar the satisfaction of pardoning him. And Caesar just couldn't let it go. And he thought he could kind of like knock Cato down a peg, but it had the opposite effect. Cato became even more of a martyr for the thing that Caesar was credited with destroying. And it was kind of the ghost of Cato, that inspired Cassius and Brutus. Brutus was his married to his daughter. It's that kind of ghost of Cato that the conspirators were resurrecting when they assassinated him.
Okay.
After he had conquered all of his enemies.
And then there's an interesting sense after his death, where at first, the Senate is, and the conspirators are basically trying to, all right, let's kind of like wrap this up as quickly as possible, and we'll honor him. We'll say he's a god, and like the people are like, all right, kind of cool, and they move forward. And it seems like things might be there might be some resolution to this, but then when they read his will and they find out that the people, he's giving a lot of money to the people, and then they see his body and it's just totally destroyed, right? Yeah. The people then start to revolt.
Yeah. And Mark Antony, his second in command, kind of tricked the conspirators. There was a standoff after he had been assassinated. The conspirators retreated to the Capitoline Hill, and Mark Antony, played the nice guy. All right, let's put all the past behind us. Caesar believed in mercy, and I believe in mercy. And then when the funeral comes, he's the guy who just like whips up the crowds into a rage.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and Shakespeare's depiction of this is quite accurate. I did not come to praise Caesar, but to bury him. So interestingly, like, Caesar had not really written Mark Antony very prominently into his will, to Mark Antony's great surprise.
Okay.
But he had given most of his property that he hadn't given away to the people to Octavian, his adoptive nephew, who he adopts in his will formally. So Octavian is suddenly Octavius Caesar. He's like 18-year-old kid that nobody knows who this kid is. And that's a whole longer story. Sure. But no, I think that part of the reason, in summary of how Octavian was able to build his own, was able to kind of like consolidate a monarchic empire, is because Caesar's death was so widely unpopular with the plebs, and he was seen as a martyr. Like, in a way, if Cato was a martyr for the Republic, Caesar became an even more powerful martyr for the Roman people after that, and they end up divinizing him, and Virgil writes poems about him and all this stuff.
And did Caesar Augustus Octavian, do you think if Caesar could have seen what would happen in Octavian's life, was Octavian sort of the fulfillment of Caesar's vision?
It's a good question. I think this really speaks to Caesar's character, so after he conquers all of his enemies, he's right before he's assassinated. The reason that they strike when they do is because Caesar is about to leave town on another grand expedition. Okay. And Plutarch says he felt emulation, he felt zeal for himself. It's this funny way of saying, so zeal for the Greeks is, as Aristotle defines it, a type of pain felt when a man sees present among others who are like him by nature, things good and honorable, which he is capable of achieving. It's that kind of competitive striving that's just fuels so many stories of greatness, right? But Caesar, he says, felt that for himself, like he wanted to outdo what he had already done. And so he was planning this expedition to conquer the Parthians, who had killed Crassus, to sweep back up over the Black Sea and knock on the Scythians and then come and spank the Germans who he had not fully dealt with in his conquest of Gaul. And it's like, it seems that he was already entertaining monarchic kind of tendencies, partly kind of, I think you could compare this really to Alexander's problem. You know, he spent a lot of time in Egypt, where that's what you do as the ruler of Egypt. And, you know, Rome was sort of moving into this position of ruling Egypt and all these peoples of the East. And Caesar sees, like, this is how these people want to be ruled by a king. And so coming back to Rome, he's just a Roman. He's the first among equals. He doesn't really resolve that issue. And so I think it's really hard to say what he would have done with the Republic had he survived. But I think he knew that Octavian, what Octavian ended up doing was kind of along the lines of what needed to happen. That the Roman Republican system just wasn't really fit to rule an empire. I think that's fair to say. There are all these abuses.
So would you say that the nature of the Roman Empire kind of then fundamentally caused the Roman Republic to sort of break, and out of which emerged then the monarchy, essentially?
Yeah, this is what a lot of historians think. I think this is basically right, that the Roman Republican government was where, I mean, basically the idea is you have these governors going out for these 1, 2, 3 tours of duty, and those are your primary administrators who are the face of Rome and the provinces. It's either them or the tax collectors or the Roman contractors. And nobody has an interest in the long-term peace and stability, except maybe the local Roman businessmen. But there's a kind of an extractive attitude that the Romans take. Like, politicians go into gigantic debt to get office, and then they go out of the province to recoup their losses by extorting the provincials. And there's all these kind of instabilities, you know, like, it ends up being the case that the people who are furthest out, who are these provincial governors, are the ones who end up commanding armies, training them up, and having the real power in Roman politics. So, you know, how can you delegate that to people who have temporary office, who can then use that power to disrupt the center? I mean, really, this is the solution that Octavian came up with, that the emperor has to control all of the armies. And the person who's in control at Rome has to control the armies at all times. So I think that, you know, you do see a move toward a lot happier provincials in the Roman Empire than they were under the Republic. I mean, the abuses were rampant. Read Cicero's orations against Verres. I mean, the minute detail that he goes into about how corrupt a guy like Verres was and how miserable the provincials were. You know, there's always problems, and, you know, you see them in the New Testament, right? The publican, the Pharisee, the tax collectors, the publicans are not popular, but you know, they end up being able to keep the peace in most regions, especially ones that don't have a kind of a troublesome monarchic religion that doesn't accept Roman cultural dominance.
So bringing all this together, I think the one thing that's struck me most, as the more that I've studied about statesmanship, is that, you know, nearly in every life, whether it's Cyrus, whether it's Caesar, whether it's Alexander, really, like, the same qualities just kind of repeat over and over again. And I'll share a few of them that I, you know, picked up on, and just feel free to jump in or interrupt. But, you know, first and foremost, there's this profound sense of destiny or providence, you know, that even leads them to take great daring risks, to even charge into battle and risk their life, because they have a sense that there's you know, a fate that they're kind of about to fulfill, right? And there's also a way in which there's an interplay between fortune and virtue, and these things have to come together. You know, maybe there's a way that you can kind of entice fortune to kind of, you know, the winds be behind your back, but these things also have to, like, come together in kind of a meeting place. The next one is the love of honor, right? That is really driving, even love of honor more than death, love of honor more than even acquiring material riches, right? Its honor is kind of paramount.
I think you even see that, on the providence point, you certainly see this in the guy like Washington. He's always talking about providence and destiny and Caesar, and, like the story where Caesar is trying to get in a boat and go bring some troops across the Adriatic, and the boatman he's in disguise because he doesn't want people to know, and the boatman's like, I don't know, sir, the waves aren't really cooperating with us, and Caesar rips off his disguise and he says, fear not, for you carry Caesar and Caesar's destiny with you. And it ends up the boat
works out. Yeah.
It doesn't actually work.
Oh, it doesn't
out.
work.
The boat has to turn back, which is kind of funny. But I think he did say those kind of things, I think. But I think that has, like, you see this in a guy like Sulla, these guys who have incredible courage, and also just like daring to do something that nobody thought they would do. It requires this sort of faith, whether you call it faith in providence or faith in God, like they really have it, and it's genuine. If it weren't genuine, they wouldn't do what they did. Yeah. They really believe in themselves profoundly.
They believe in themselves. They also, they often begin with the gods and everything. Cyrus always, before he does anything, sacrifices to the gods.
Yeah.
Alexander, is constantly visiting these oracles to kind of affirm this destiny. So that's a big part. Another thing that kind of strikes me is the clemency that they show towards the people that they defeat and towards their enemies.
Yes. Alexander, even more, gentle in victory than he is fierce in battle, as Plutarch says.
Remarkable. The restraint component of the, and it's not that they don't have the desires, the lust of kind of the flesh. Cyrus even talks about this, but he, it's that they learn to kind of suppress it because they want glory more than they want short-term pleasure.
Yeah, they want that honor. It's that love of honor again, which is just philotimia in Greek, which is their word for ambition. It's like literally the love of honor. Like, this is how you can judge somebody who's going to do great things. They love honor. Yeah, it's like the litmus test. But and I think you see this with Caesar's clemency. Like he pardons Domitius Ahenobarbus at Corfinium, and the guy just goes and joins Pompey's side anyway. I mean, he's just like ostentatiously generous and clement. But you can also see there are a couple of instances where, like when Caesar has to kind of confiscate the treasury of Rome, and this tribune named Metellus stands up. He's like, Caesar, I will not let you, take this gold from the temple. And Caesar says, it would be harder for me to give the command to my soldiers than to have you killed. Like, the most effort I would have to expend to have you killed is to just snap my fingers. And he basically threatens the tribune with his life. And the story got out and people saw it. And Plutarch says, I think this shows you that Caesar was not naturally clement by nature.
Yeah.
He used it as a tool. He knew that it was important as a leader. And you can see this in other instances. Like, it's a conscious choice. It's not because they're nice guys. Right.
Yeah. It's part of the strategy and the tactics. Then maybe lastly, two more that come to mind. One is kind of the generosity, strategic generosity, right? They never, when they have an opportunity when they come to wealth or acquire wealth, they never hoard it for themselves. They make everyone around them rich and wealthy and prosperous, right? Because they're kind of storing up favors from which they can then harvest kind of glory and honor later, but they never keep it for themselves. They're always like giving it away. Yeah,
you see this at a young age with Sulla too, the great later dictator. As a young staff officer in Marius's army in Africa, he's always going out of his way to do favors for just regular guys, and he's giving money away, and he's having parties, and he's absolutely refuses to take any payback, and it's not because he's just giving this stuff away for nothing. It's because he's thinking long term about, he wants these people to be loyal to him. He's building something that's worth much more than any of the money that he has. Clemency and generosity really they go hand in hand with these great leaders.
And then maybe lastly, they're also, in addition to being kind of military conquerors, they're also builders of I think, both beautiful and useless things, whether it's roads and infrastructure or temples or monuments, right? There's a way in which they're really preserving their legacy and while also kind of elevating the common people's hopes.
Yeah. It's about that honor outlasting them, you know, and also about like, just like the general happiness of the citizenry that they're trying to kind of represent to themselves. I think Nietzsche talks about how architecture is like the art closest to greatness, you know, because you're leaving things that are so permanent. But, you know, Caesar builds the Temple of Clementia after his victory. I mean, all of the great Roman first men have these great building projects. Pompey the Great himself has this great theater built. It's actually a temple because you're not allowed to build a theater in Rome. So they stick a little shrine on top of it. But that's where Julius Caesar gets assassinated, actually, is in the theater that Pompey built. There was a Senate meeting house. And he falls at the feet of the statue of Pompey when he's murdered. But, you know, Caesar's the Basilica Julia, the Curia Julia in Rome today is the original. I mean, it's not the original, but like that's a building that Julius Caesar built to restore the Senate house that had burned down in the 50s on a new location. So yeah, they leave their mark on history, and it's like lovely to walk in the buildings they created
to this day. I was just in the Roman Forum in March, and there were piles of flowers at the tomb of Julius Caesar. You know, it was just the anniversary of his death or his birthday. I don't know which one, but it was a huge procession.
Ides of March, maybe.
Actually, of course. Right. So there we go. So to what extent do you think that these tactics are, I guess if we're looking at it from a kind of a Christian perspective, to what extent do you think those tactics are corrosive to the soul, right? Because there is a sense where you're acquiring. It's the acquisition of power, the acquisition of people through favors, through gifts, right? Through military, through empire building, like, or is it? Do those things not necessarily have to be corrosive to the soul? They're just perhaps part of being a great leader. How do you sort through that?
Yeah. One of the perennial questions in Christian political theory, for sure, and, you know, city of man versus the city of God. I think that a lot of Christian leaders throughout history, guys like Constantine and Theodosius, Justinian, you know, Theodosius putting down the riots in Milan, Justinian with the Nika riots, of course, great wars they fight, acquiring power. I think that Christian political theorists have generally been inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt that, you know, rulership requires facing fallen human nature head on, and bad people are going to do bad things and you have to punish them. And, you know, if you want to rise to power, you're going to face a lot of political opponents, and it's going to take a kind of supreme willfulness to get over this. It's going to take a kind of greatness of spirit, what might even seem as pride, you know? But God has, in his providence, a role for people like that to play, to hold states together, to ensure that the faith is defended against the heathen mobs and hordes and so forth. So I think that it's kind of, you know, the rulers are to be, they know that they're going to be held accountable if they've got good, you know, priests and bishops and monks around them. And the monk kind of takes on this role of philosopher as the parousia deliverer in the Byzantine Empire. But, you know, they're taking a risk, not just with their lives, but with their souls too. And it's a huge responsibility. But I think that, you know, a guy like Constantine can look to models both like Julius Caesar and Marcus Aurelius, and like he can look at somebody like King David, you know, who had to make some tough choices, and seeing his own son executed and things like that. So I think there are no easy answers, but a wise Christian would say, you know, we're living in a fallen world, and you have to make tough choices sometimes, and you have to kind of have in order for somebody like to really rise to the occasion of being king. It takes a kind of greatness of soul. It takes a megalopsychia. It takes ambition, which is very problematic. But it can be done in more just and more unjust ways. And I think that the classics can really give you a lot of fine-grained sense for how to do it the right way to the extent that it's possible.
In closing, you are an educator yourself. You left the academy to really devote your life to really reaching, I think, the next generation here in America with these ideas, with the lives of Plutarch, with Caesar, with Alexander and others. What is motivating, driving, inspiring you to do that? Why do you think that work is so important?
Yeah, I think part of it is, in a way, I'm making something that I wish existed when I was a young man, because I could have used a lot more guidance. I had this growing sense that there was something missing in classical education, in particular in the world of professional classics, where we still have this kind of vestigial notion of the great books. But even that, of course, is very much eroded by, people trying to say that we should be spending our time looking at, graffiti from Pompeii instead of reading Homer. Sure. And, you can make it through an entire degree in classics without reading anything great, which is a tragedy. But I think that on the whole, people still have this sense that they're great books. But I think that what we're really shying away from is what I think is actually going on with the reason that the classics get preserved and people spend so much time and money and labor copying these texts over for centuries and forefronting them in their education is really, I think of the canon of Western civilization as not a canon of great books so much as a canon of great men. And you can see this in Homer's Iliad to begin with. Like, the whole world of oral epic poetry is a world where the story changes a little bit on every telling. The poet has a lot of license to use different words to even kind of change the details of the story. But what remains the same is the heroes that you're interested in learning about. Yeah. I want to know about Achilles. Tell me the story about what Achilles did on this time, or tell me a story I haven't heard about Achilles. The canon in Greek is a measuring rod. It's something that you measure yourself against. It's kind of like Plutarch, the mirror of history. When you look into history, when you look into a mirror, you see yourself, and you see that reveals something about who you are by looking at a figure who's great and different from you, and kind of reveals your own flaws and the kind of where you need to put some makeup on.
You don't measure yourself against a book. You measure yourself against the book.
Man. Yeah, you measure yourself against a person. And so the books give you access to those paradigms of greatness. But fundamentally, the Western canon is a canon of heroes.
Sure.
And I think Plutarch gives you access to that. And there are other texts that do that too. And we have our own heroes in America, and other countries have their own heroes. But these are the kind of foundational ones for the history of the West. And so that's why I'm just never tired of talking about Plutarch and his examples of greatness that we all need.
Great. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure, Johnny. Thanks for having me.